Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, from wherever you are. I'm Dr. Andrew Colombo-Lagavito, and I am an assistant professor at the University of North Texas. And I'm here presenting on behalf of myself and my co-author, Dr. Scott McNamara, who just recently took a position as an assistant professor at the University of New Hampshire. And I'm going to be talking about our presentation entitled Social Media is Navigating the Purpose, Ethics, and Access of Digital Methods for Kinesiology for Individuals with Disabilities. Now, in order to start our conversation, oftentimes when we think about social media and we go into Google and we do a search for social media or different social media websites, you may come across some conflicting information. We might get information like social media is toxic or bad for our mental health, or that it's good for you or beneficial for democratic values. And unfortunately, in our world, as I'm sure many of you know, issues are not black and white. There are many layers of gray, and social media can be both of these things, and in fact, most likely is both of these things. Now, when we think about it in a research context, it can also be both of these things. We can use social media in a good way to generate data that might not be able to be generated in other ways or in different types of data, but we could also use it poorly, in which there are repercussions that are negative for our research. And so today I'm hoping to start the conversation amongst colleagues about what this might look like moving forward as we move into a world that is becoming ever more digital. Now, for today, we're going to briefly cover these topics because I want to spend time at the end. I want to leave enough time at the end for us to have an open discussion about how we can use social media for digital generation, data generation, in a positive way. And so we'll first talk about what digital spaces exist or could exist. We'll have an ethics-rooted overview of what that might look like. And then I'll talk about a case example from a study that was recently completed by Dr. Scott McNamara, my co-author, as well as myself and two others, Dr. Henny Kumferstein and Dr. Josephine Blagrave. And then that will hopefully set us up to have a nice open discussion at the end. Before I get into it, though, I do want to say a few disclaimers. First, that we're still learning each of these and incorporating each of these practices into our own research, and in no way should what we talk about today be taken as a right or wrong way or an only way to conduct research on social media. We're simply highlighting what we've learned and hopefully creating a dialogue. And we also want to make sure that this discussion does not dissuade others from conducting this research. We recognize that it can be sort of a big thing to take on a new research area, and it can be a scary environment if you don't navigate these spaces on a regular basis. But we hope that through this conversation we can examine the need and recognize the need to have a conversation about this, and especially with a dynamic, ever-changing digital landscape in which we are hurtling towards at an ever-increasing rate. I would also like to acknowledge that I have the privilege to present today from the occupied lands of the Kickapoo and Wichita Native peoples. Even though I'm at the University of North Texas, this land is on occupied land. Now, in starting our conversation, social media or social media networks aren't any one particular thing. And it's a term that is constantly in flux. Right? We have social medias that companies and websites that have come and gone. New ones come up every single day, and something new and popular can spring up out of nowhere. Most of you probably recognize at least a few of these logos on the screen at the moment. There's things like Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, as well as YouTube, LinkedIn, Pinterest, TikTok, Snapchat, as well as Vine and WhatsApp and WeChat. Now, Vine is gone. It no longer exists, but it set the stage for things like TikTok, which are short video clips that people post. Sometimes they're dances, sometimes they're observations, a lot of it's comedy. It's all over the place. We also have things that are traditionally messenger apps, but could be considered social media, like WeChat or WhatsApp. And in fact, research has existed that uses certain tools, communication tools, such as WhatsApp, in order to reach individuals, to provide an intervention, because that's a primary way that folks communicate in certain countries around the globe. And the point here is that all of these companies, no matter what they are, have drastically changed the way that we communicate with one another over the last decade, and probably even since the start of the internet. There's been some form of a social network, if we consider going back all the way to Friendster or MySpace. And when we think about it, social media isn't a small thing. At the beginning of 2021, there was an estimated 4.3 billion, with a B, individuals who were social media users. It doesn't mean it was on any one platform, but just as in aggregate. Over half of the global population used some kind of social media. And for some places in the world, it may actually be the internet for some folks. In certain South Asian countries, Facebook is the primary way folks access the internet. And so these tools, as I mentioned before, they can be used to serve as good, provide access, provide information, but they can also be used for bad, such as misinformation, social comparison, all that stuff that comes with it. Now, when we look at even further what use looks like in terms of percentages, as I mentioned, 55% of the world's population was on some kind of social media. Roughly, almost 14% is the annual change, right? It increases by about 500 million persons each year. And that, of course, is different across each of the platforms. Things like Facebook have around 2.3 billion users. TikTok has around 750 million active users each month. And the percentages of those go through their mobile phones, right? I mean, look at this. And again, these numbers may not represent unique individuals, because folks can have multiple accounts, but a good amount of people are spending quite a bit of time on social media. As you can see, about almost 2.5 hours of every day on social media. And again, that's a range, right? Certainly people spend much more, and certainly people spend much less, but folks are using it nonetheless. More and more of our daily lives are represented or expressed in these digital spaces. And so when we think about what does that mean for research, well, when you look at these two images, you see Facebook and we see a public park. At what point do we differentiate between the two as in terms of public spaces? As a researcher, I could go and do observational research in a public park, and I wouldn't need necessarily informed consent, as long as I'm not taking identifiable information, and etc. Could we do the same on Facebook? And at what point do things on Facebook, or in public for that matter, should we be ethically allowed to collect? Right? Where is that dividing line? And certainly, there has been a wealth of discussion around this topic, but as we lend it over to social media, when you look at user agreements, and this comes directly from Facebook, when you publish content or information using the everyone setting, it means that you are allowing everyone, including people off Facebook, to access and use that information and to associate it with you. Now, for most of us, we may recognize this, but for the average user, that might be buried and they may never recognize that. They may never take the time to look through their settings to see what is and isn't available to everyone. And when they publish something to everyone, do they really expect that a researcher is going to come through and use that information for a particular study? And Facebook is certainly not without controversies, as I know many of you have probably heard. But when we look at other types of social media companies, some make it a little bit easier and harder to access information. Twitter, for example, allows you to use what's called an application programming interface, or an API, that you can write some code and pull real live data, real-time data, vast amounts of content live, just without even going into it, without even accessing any interface specifically. And this is said not to scare, frighten, or push people away from this. But what I want to point out is that with users and with this ability to access wealth of information that is in a public space, there's an ability to reach communities that we may not normally be able to access. It might be able to reach a set of communities that are using the tool, like social media or any specific one, in order to build their community. Within the U.S., the Black Lives Matter movement have used social media in order to organize and spread information in a very quick and decentralized way. Me Too allowed folks to see, particularly women, to see and find a sense of camaraderie among other survivors of sexual trauma. And we're able to share stories in a way that we're able to be connected simply through a hashtag. We also see that certain quote-unquote vulnerable communities, communities that tend to be marginalized, such as the LGBTQIA groups, Indigenous and First Nations peoples, as well as disabled individuals, all have been able to leverage and build community and build advocacy movements through social media, whether it is now through things like Twitter and TikTok and Facebook, or before where it was message boards or groups like InLive, in which it was a website database where folks, or almost like a email listserv where people just communicated through email, but that brought folks together and folks were able to see there are people around me that have shared experiences. Even though I may not see them in my day-to-day life, I can connect with them. You can have folks who are in major cities across the globe connect with those who are spread out in the rural areas of our country, of our various countries. We can have people in Africa connecting with folks in Europe and Asia and in the Pacific. We can leverage these, and as researchers, we can access this information in order to be able to build a better research practice. And it's important that though social media has shown negative effects, particularly among certain groups, because of this ability to connect with others, they may have a greater chance in which to increase their happiness because they can find that connection. And so really when we look at this, it can be a wild west of ethics, right? I mean, our idea of social media certainly isn't a static thing, and ethics are not a static thing. If we think about what is considered ethical today, what's considered ethical 50 years ago would not be considered ethical today. These things change, and it changes with conversations. So when we look at what is guiding us in this space, there's a lack of information, particularly from federal regulators or institutions. Particularly, there's very little information about how internal review should be conducted when using social media networks. And the information that is out there can often be conflicting. In some use agreements that folks sign up for social media, it has clauses in there saying that their information may be used for research. Yet, depending on the type of work that you might be doing, that might be more than just pulling somebody's information off of a public space. The Finnish National Board, in their recent guidelines, didn't mention social media, though they did mention that there still needs to be consideration in terms of what the research is being done in terms of risk and benefit. The other issue that can arise is whether the researcher themselves is following the terms of service by a given provider, and whether or not they're actually engaging in a binding contract with that provider. For example, Twitter does not, in their rules, does not allow researchers to do data mining, where you just go in and you pull all the information you can. Although we know that happens. Right? It's hard to police this space. It's hard to know when folks are following the rules, and it's, to this point, much on the honor system. We do have, which was released by several researchers in collaboration with the U.S. Homeland Security, NHS, National Homeland Security, released the Menlo Report, which is meant to be complementary to the Belmont Report. It's tailored specifically for information and communication technology research. And it shares first, of course, the three basic principles of respect for people, beneficence, and justice, but it adds respect for law and public interest. And these are meant to inform and guide researchers in ethical analyses and self-regulation. And what they meant was that first you have to engage in legal due diligence. Right? So are you actually following the laws set out by the particular company you happen to be working through? It also means that you should be transparent with your methods and your results. I mean, sharing it with the people that you actually collected data from. And ultimately be accountable for whatever actions that you may take. Meaning, if you go and do research that's more than just observational, that if something goes wrong, that you take the steps necessary to correct them. And so it really falls into compliance, transparency, and accountability. We also have the Association for Internet Research published a similar document, 2012, in which they outlined certain questions and considerations, but they urged a case-by-case approach, which may be difficult, right? That might raise some red flags for folks. We also have, particularly for Twitter, an organization released tactics, which is first transparency, anonymity, control, tracking, IRB, and context, right? So first, making sure that your objectives and your methods, it's all accessible. You provide that information somehow. You protect the tweets of authors. So when you are publishing, you're not connecting those two pieces of information together. Though, that information is put out in a public space, that doesn't mean we always have to publish those names, unless, of course, you have consent. Obviously, you want to make sure that you are honoring a way for folks to control their own personal data, so you're giving access to make sure that they can voluntarily remove their data. We're not tracking, right? So you of course can track people across different spaces, so make sure you're not doing that. You're working with the IRB collaboratively. We'll talk about how that can be an issue in just a moment. And then, of course, you're adding the context. You're not taking certain things out of context. So what might that look like? Well, if we think of observational research, in the example I mentioned with the public park, first, does it meet the criteria for human subjects research? Right? We know certain types of research can be exempt from ethical review. And that's, of course, different from country to country. We also want to know what the risk level is, or the content of the study. So is it something that may have some burden imposed on persons, and so therefore we want to make sure they understand how their data is being used. In terms of interactive research, we want to make sure you provide an accurate portrayal. And this is something where you're going in social media and engaging with folks, and much like you would in person. You're just doing it in a digital space. Moreno et al. Suggest that certain things like friending or following may not necessarily be important to consider in terms of ethical review, but it might be important to consider thinking about how folks interact, how influence can occur, right? When we think about any potential conflicts of interest that might come up, could that fall into that category? And then, of course, in survey and interview research, we want to make sure you have contact information or questions during the consent process, right? Because you are collecting information, you're likely collecting identifiable information, so people are going to have to be able to consent to that. So, let's finish with an example. So, we did a study that's currently under review, and I will love to talk about the study and what we found outside of this, but what I want to point out is just some of the steps that we went through and struggles we faced. First, we did this qualitatively, so we used Twitter chats, which is essentially a way where it's threaded conversations on Twitter that we believe was similarly represented of a focus group. Yet it was open and it was asynchronous, so people didn't have to respond at the same time. And that was a benefit. Right? We got people from different places across the world that may not have been able to interact together, and we were able to recruit a fairly unique sample of autistic adults that would have been difficult in a traditional sense. We had a number of individuals who identified as female or as trans as a trans woman, and they are typically excluded from standard research. The difficulty came in terms of ethical approval, and it took us about 4 months in order to get ethical approval for this particular study. The struggles came up when we were talking particularly about the informed consent process and how that would occur, and the IRB, individuals on the IRB not understanding necessarily how Twitter interacts as a service, right? They wanted it closed off, walled off, so only people who consented could take part. But that was sort of antithetical to what we were trying to do in terms of being open and creating a dialogue among community members that we may not have the reach for. The other part with consent was first, we wanted to do an informed consent process. We recognized the need, particularly because we were interacting with people, to have them consent, to say, yes, I understand this is what your data is for. The difficulty, of course, came in when, what if someone takes part in a conversation in which they have not consented ahead of time? And so ultimately, we thought of using potentially passive consent, in which one of us would inform them to say, hey, you've just responded on a thread that is being used for this research purpose. If you'd like to, if you don't want your information used, let us know and we'll take it off. We won't include it. And the IRB didn't approve of that one. They wanted full consent from everyone. And so if during our chats someone came in who hadn't been consented prior, we sent them a DM, a direct message, and gave them access to the informed consent document. And those who didn't fill that out, we ultimately didn't include in our process. Ultimately, it worked out, but it was certainly a long back and forth. And ultimately, we think it did have some very interesting findings, in which I'm happy to talk about it another time. What did come up, particularly because we were talking about physical health on Twitter, one individual came forward and said this, honestly, it seems like a really weird question to put on Twitter. They felt it should have been in the consent, and that questions like that need input, because they assumed that it was absurd, everyone can exercise. Another individual mentioned that they wouldn't be comfortable talking about health openly on social media, but liked the idea of the reach. And so, of course, as I mentioned in the disclaimer, we don't claim to know the right way all the time. And I think things like this help as a learning experience. So when we talk about health, when we talk about movement and physical activity, particularly with the populations we work with, it's important to get these differing perspectives. Right? Oftentimes, I think a lot of us in kinesiology and in adapted PA, we assume everyone needs to exercise, everyone can exercise. And even folks who join our studies, most likely some kind of bias in which they have an interest and therefore are likely to join a research study. Through this, we were able to reach folks because it didn't take into account that preconceived notion of needing or wanting or liking activity, that we got responses such as this. And I think we had a different, deeper analysis based on using social media as a tool. We wouldn't have had the same findings had we done it traditionally. And so, to prompt our discussion with the time we have left, which I don't know it's very much at this point because I've talked quite a bit. First, what practices are necessary to ensure an ethical informed consent is obtained? How can we maintain confidentiality when generating data in public spaces or even anonymity? when we consider the populations we work with and the domain in which we work in, how can we respect the communities that we engage with? And then how can we push regulatory organizations to maintain high standards of ethics and keep up with this ever-changing landscape? And these are the questions we've had. These are certainly not all-encompassing, and there's certainly many more to discuss. But in order to boost the discussion, we'd love to hear from you on this. And so thank you for your time. Really looking forward to our discussion. There's my contact information, and I'm looking forward to talking with all of you. Thank you.